The good news is that Stephen's paper has already generated a sizable queue for question and answer. The bad news is that it's already generated a sizable queue for question and answer. For those of you who haven't gotten on it, good luck. So I'm gonna read Dick Fallon's comments here. I deeply regret that I cannot be in San Diego today to comment in person on Professor Sachs' splendid paper, Originalism as a Theory of Legal Change. I also regret that a health emergency involving my elderly mother has stopped me from rereading Professor Sachs' paper as carefully as I would have wished before preparing these brief comments. If I've missed the point, I beg your indulgence. As I read Professor Sachs' paper, it includes three claims that I find especially comment-worthy. First, originalism is better understood as a claim about law than as a claim about interpretation. Second, the best version of originalism has at its core what Professor Sachs calls the Continuity Thesis, which holds that, quote, whatever was part of the law at the founding is still valid law today, unless it's been validly changed in between. In a controversial interpretation of the Continuity Thesis, Professor Sachs also maintains that for any change in the law to count as valid, it has to have occurred pursuant to rules of change that were in place at the founding. Third, Professor Sachs argues that the best arguments in support of originalism and the Continuity Thesis is a legal argument, as distinguished from what he identifies as conceptual arguments and normative arguments. To have three such important and provocative theses in a single paper is a lot. Of these three theses, the first, that originalism is a claim about the nature of law, not just about the proper interpretation of law, seems to me correct. Among other things, the best theory of interpretation will almost surely depend on the nature of what is being interpreted. To take a simplistic example, the best or right way to interpret a play or a painting is likely to be different from the best or right way to interpret a legal document or the Constitution. Although this point seems to me to be correct, I do not think it is as strongly original as Professor Sachs's other central claims. Among the writers omitted from his discussion is Ronald Dworkin, to whom I shall refer later again. The inseparability of a theory of adjudication from a theory of law and vice versa lies at the heart of Dworkin's famous argument against H.L.A. Hart that law is not a system of rules. According to Dworkin, one cannot understand what judges do in interpreting the law in hard cases without coming to grips with the nature of law itself. Now a few words about the continuity thesis. As Professor Sachs says explicitly, it seems likely that every actually existing legal system respects some kind of continuity. Or, as I would put it, law by its nature claims authority to control the future. And the existence of law in the present requires acknowledgement of a continuity with the past that invests some prior authority or authorities, but not every purported prior authority, with the capacity to make law that binds today. If this is right, then the novelty and bite of the continuity thesis inheres in the gloss that Professor Sachs says originalism imposes on it. The only valid changes in the law of the United States are those that accord with the rules of change existing at the founding. On this point, I note that Professor Sachs appears to conjoin under what he calls the continuity thesis something analogous but not identical to both of what Larry Solem in his paper for this conference calls the fixation thesis and a very stringent version of what Solem calls the constraint thesis. This comparison helps to bring out how very stringent Professor Sachs's version of the continuity thesis and thus of originalism appears to be. But is Professor Sachs's version of the continuity thesis, which says there cannot be any valid change of law not occurring pursuant to rules existing at the founding, correct? It is certainly true that substantive laws, such as statutes, continue in force within a legal system unless they are validly changed. And the same is true of the Constitution, in the minimal sense that the Constitution is almost universally accepted as a controlling legal authority, albeit as one that sometimes must be interpreted before it can be implied. But Professor Sachs's continuity thesis holds that the Constitution's legal effect must also remain unchanged unless the change in effect reflects the application of rules of adjudication and change traceable to the founding. Of this, I'm not persuaded. I would say, yes, we have the same Constitution as at the founding, but we interpret it differently now, and validly so. Current practice and the widespread acceptance of that practice give legal status and validity to changed interpretive practices. We can have the same Constitution differently interpreted, just as we can have the same river, even if the shape and the depth of the river have changed over time, and even if it has been diverted at one or more points to flow around rather than through some parcels of land. Whatever I might say on this point, I should emphasize that Professor Sachs seems to want to engage in a dispute with other originalists when he says that his version of the continuity thesis constitutes the best version of originalism. I leave it to others to take up that challenge. With that said, I now come to Professor Sachs's third noteworthy claim, which is that the best argument for originalism in the continuity thesis is a legal argument. On this point, I read his paper as being somewhat ambivalent about what he has set out to do in this paper, standing alone, and about what this paper has accomplished. I would also say that this is a point on which I think he should either buttress his argument or weaken his claim. In saying that his argument is a legal argument, Professor Sachs seems to want to distinguish legal from conceptual and normative arguments. More specifically, he thinks that his conclusion is one that we ought to come to with help of our usual positivist toolbox, determining contemporary law based on contemporary social facts. Having said this, Professor Sachs acknowledges that his paper does not offer a full defense of his version of the continuity thesis. He says that he's more interested in showing that it is important in giving us insight into current constitutional debates. But I'm not sure what Professor Sachs can that Professor Sachs can let himself off so easily, because he also says quite clearly that his version of the continuity thesis offers a better argument for originalism than others on offer, and that it offers a legal argument for originalism. At this point, I feel entitled to ask what exactly the legal argument for the continuity thesis is, beyond knowing that it is one likely to emerge from the positivist toolkit. To me, as indeed to many, though not all originalists, it seems quite clear that much of our current constitutional practice is not originalist, and that originalism is often presented as an argument for greater or lesser reform of existing practice. In support of his apparently contrary contention, Professor Sachs observes, as if he were excavating the plain legal fact of the matter, that the official story told by courts is largely consistent with the continuity thesis, and that if practice departs from professed commitments and beliefs, it's expressed beliefs rather than everyday practices that ground our legal commitments. In offering the second of these two claims, that it's expressed beliefs rather than everyday practices that ground our legal commitments, Professor Sachs cites to a work in progress of his own. And maybe that work in progress will vindicate his claim. For the moment, though, my suggestion would be that the purported conclusion of his forthcoming paper is a necessary foundation for his argument in the paper that we read for the conference. My reason is this. If continuity in the strong sense that Professor Sachs interprets it is not a necessary feature of legal systems generally, and if many reasonable people in our legal system do not agree that we have had the especially stringent form of continuity with the founding that Professor Sachs says we have had, we need some non-question begging way of establishing who is right and who is wrong about what conclusion a positivist toolkit yields. Here's the point at which I want to invoke Ronald Dworkin once again. Given widespread dispute about the point in issue, I follow Dworkin in doubting that there is or could be a plain legal fact of the matter about whether our legal system requires the particularly stringent form of continuity that Professor Sachs says it requires. Recall that Professor Sachs has said that his argument is not conceptual. It is not an argument about what law inherently requires. And he has said it is not normative about what would be the best way to understand our law as requiring. He says it is legal. But I, following Dworkin, am disposed to say that this is the kind of legal question that one cannot answer without taking a normative stand about what would be the best way to understand or interpret our law. And I would add to that this is the conclusion to which the version of soft positivism that H.L.A. Hart embraced later in his career would also point. In the end, I thus think that Professor Sachs's paper falls short of establishing its conclusion because it includes a lacuna, which he may be able to fill, involving the legal criteria by which we ought to adjudge his contested claim that the requirements of legal continuity rule out any change of interpretive practice within the American legal system that does not accord with the law as it existed at the founding. And with that observation, I come to an end except to say how deeply I regret that I will not be present to hear the many interesting things that Professor Sachs will undoubtedly have to say in response to my questions and comments. As I said, his is a splendid, challenging, thoughtful, and provocative paper, and I have no doubt that Professor Sachs will have a splendid, challenging, thoughtful, and provocative responses to my observations about it. Let me just say, having just done Dick Fallon on this, just a couple of points that there are really two aspects of originalist theory. One is that, who are the authorities whose posited norms are our law? And the second is, how should one decipher those norms given the symbols by which they are expressed? Now, the latter is the focus of the debate between original intended meaning and original public meaning or speaker's meaning, utterance meaning versus speaker's meaning. I view Sachs's thesis is one about the first question. It's a rule of recognition account of originalism. And there are really two versions. I just want to leave it at that. One is that our rule of recognition today is that the Constitution of 1789 and its organic amendments is the law today. The second, and this I think is the one that Stephen is endorsing, our rule of recognition today is, as I've just described it, and it has always been the rule of recognition since 1789. So with that, Stephen, you have it in